Hello and welcome to Willow Cove Crafts, my channel here on YouTube where I talk about knitting and sewing and my other crafty endeavors. My name is Emily and today's video is all about everything that I worked on in the month of November. In late October, I decided to abandon all of my current works in progress in the hopes of finishing the most perfect red sweater in time to wear for Christmas. Now, this sweater has taken up most of my crafting time this month, and it all started with the arrival of some very special yarn. One of my favorite channels here on YouTube is the Crea Bea podcast with Rebecca. And recently Rebecca has been recommending the Wee County Yarns Kinross 4-ply base. She spoke so highly of the yarn's incredible softness after blocking that I knew I absolutely needed to try it. I ordered 8 skeins in the colorway Mary, which is the most beautiful, cool toned red, and I knew that it would make the most perfect Christmas sweater. Wee County Yarns is located in Scotland, and their Kinross 4-ply base, which is a worsted spun fingering weight yarn, is made by local cashmere specialists Todd and Duncan. While this yarn is a 100% lamb's wool base, I think that its softness rivals the cashmere that its makers are known for. This yarn does have a lot of spinning oil left in it, so when it arrived, it was a bit stiff and crunchy. I was expecting this based off of some of the reviews I read and knew that the magic of this yarn really came with blocking. So I knit up my swatch and excitedly put it in a bath to soak. And as I expected, the transformation was truly amazing. Washing out all of that spinning oil and giving the fibers a chance to relax and bloom really produced the most soft and glorious fabric. So I eagerly cast on my new sweater. knitting the Culm Pullover by Fiona Alice. I first came across this sweater while scrolling through Instagram, and I was immediately in love with its classic silhouette, all over texture, and subtle yet striking details. This sweater is knit from the bottom up and has a drop shoulder construction, and it is almost entirely knit in moss stitch with the exception of a twisted rib panel going up the center front. It also has a really interesting eyelet detail on the hem, cuffs, and sleeve seams. And it's that little detail that I think makes this sweater super special and unique. It's something that I've never seen before, and I found it quite interesting and striking on an otherwise simple sweater. In terms of modifications, the original pattern features a split in the back hem. I've seen this design choice in other patterns before, and it's never really been something that interests me. It feels a little random and like you're trying to emphasize your butt crack, so I decided to remove it. The original hem is knit flat in order to create the split, and then joined in the round after the hem is complete to start working the rest of the body. So in order to omit the split, I cast on one extra stitch than what is specified in the pattern to create an even stitch count. And then I just started knitting in the round straight away. I did have to do a little thinking to convert the instructions for knitting flat into knitting in the round, but overall the techniques in this pattern are pretty basic, so I didn't find this part too tricky. Working on this sweater has been a good mix of being relaxing yet engaging. I find that the moss stitch section is pretty mindless and intuitive, but then that front center panel with the twisted rib does take a little bit more concentration. So I feel like I get a little rest as I work the moss stitch, and then on that center panel, I get a little bit more interest. Since the sweater is knit out of a fingering weight yarn and it's made up almost entirely of some variation of a knit one, purl one stitch pattern, it has been extremely slow going. It requires a lot of patience. However, I have reached sleeve separation, and so I am hoping that now that I've finished the body of the sweater, the rest of it will feel like it moves along a little bit more quickly. As I mentioned, this has been the majority of my crafting time this month, so I have been working on it monogamously for about 4 weeks. And at this point, I'm a little nervous I might not finish it in time for Christmas. But I will keep chugging along and get as much done as I can. At the very least, I'll have a cute sweater to wear next year. One of my goals this winter is to finally get over my fear of sewing with knit fabrics. For those of you that don't know, most fabrics fall into one of two categories. The first category is woven fabrics, where the fibers are interlocked together horizontally and vertically. The second category is knit fabrics, where the fibers are interlooped together, very similarly to how you would construct a hand knit piece of fabric. Because of the looped construction of knit fabrics, it makes them very stretchy. And it presents a lot of consideration when sewing with them to make sure that your stitching can hold up to the stretch of the fabric. And it is all very intimidating to me. I have been afraid to try it. But I've done a lot of research and I think I am ready to give it a go. I have selected a very basic t-shirt pattern, the Lark Tee by Grainline Studio, to be my first project. I really liked this pattern because there are 4 sleeve options and 4 neckline options, which if you're keeping count, gives you 16 different t-shirts. That's a lot of shirts. For my first attempt, I am planning to make the long sleeve version with a crew neck, and I have selected a light gray 100% cotton jersey that I purchased from Blackbird Fabrics. While I haven't actually done any sewing yet, I did do some work this month to get my pattern pieces prepared. And I filmed the whole thing for you, so please come along with me as I assemble and trace my pieces. So my goal for today is just to prepare and assemble my pattern. For those of you that have maybe never ever sewn a garment at all, most patterns these days can be bought as a PDF. And so you just get a digital download and then you can print them from your home printer. And then you have to do the yucky task of assembling it, which is my least favorite part. I absolutely hate assembling patterns. It's just long and boring, and like, I make clothes because I like sewing and working with fabric, not paper, but it must be done. And we'll see how far I get. I definitely want to assemble the pattern today, maybe cut out my fabric, but I'm usually pretty emotionally drained after doing the pattern assembly, so I might need a little break when I'm done, in which case I will work on my knitting and pick up sewing a different day. When you print your sewing patterns, they put this test square on the first page, and so you basically just have to follow the printing instructions and make sure that your test square is the size that they tell you it should be, and that ensures that your pieces will be the correct size when you assemble them. But they typically come out like this, and they have this edge on them, and so if you kind of lay these out, you can see that this is one continuous piece. And so what you have to do first is trim typically two sides of the paper. Like, you'll trim all of them on the left and bottom so that you can start layering these and taping them together, and then you don't get this extra bit. I hope that makes sense, but I'm gonna start trimming my pages. All right, that was not too bad. Shirts are less pieces of paper than dresses, that is for sure. And so now it's time to assemble. You literally just tape them together. And I often find this part a bit frustrating because it never fits together exactly right. Like, you know, you put your pieces down and you expect it to come together like a perfect little puzzle, but sometimes your lines are a little off. It's usually nothing major that you can't work through, but there's definitely some distortion that happens in the printing process. Every time I've ever assembled a pattern, this has happened, where like you get to a point where your pieces are like a couple millimeters off, and you just have to work through it. You have to push through the pain and just fudge it a little bit, I suppose. But let's assemble. So I did want to show you what I was talking about. So it typically happens towards the end. I assume it can only be user error. Like, your cuts are like a little off by, you know, a millimeter or two, and then eventually it throws the whole thing a little off. But like here, you know, there's a little gap you can see where the lines just didn't perfectly meet up. They do meet up over here. And so the things I try to look for and what I try to fudge is that, you know, if one side meets up, that's good. And then down here on the other side of the paper, this still looks like a pretty good continuous line. And so I try to keep it as smooth as possible. I am making the largest size, and so, you know, that's another thing I consider is making sure that my size looks pretty good. And, you know, I can easily like connect this line, and, you know, it's just a couple millimeters. It's not gonna throw off the whole thing, but it is a minor annoyance that comes with assembling your own patterns. All right, we're all taped together. We've got a sleeve piece, we've got the back piece, front piece, and then the, what do you call this? Neckband. The neckband is what you call that. So something I used to do when I assembled patterns like this is I would physically cut out my size from the printer paper. And I learned pretty quickly that I don't like doing that for two reasons. The answer is twofold. Reason number one is, as we've discussed, I hate assembling patterns. I don't want to do it more than is absolutely necessary. If I cut out my size from the printer paper, that means I can't make any of the other sizes. So, you know, if I am not always the same size, if I make a certain pattern as a gift for someone else who's a different size, I would then have to reprint and reassemble my pattern, which is not something I have any interest in doing ever whatsoever. So that's reason one, I don't cut it out of the physical paper, printer paper. Reason number two is I have found that printer paper is just a little stiff and hard to work with when you actually go to cut your fabric out. Pre-printed, pre-assembled sewing patterns are on like more of a tissue type paper. It's really thin. It's easier to work with in my opinion. So I like to try and recreate that when I assemble my own patterns. They make tracing paper specific for sewists. You can buy it. I don't know how expensive it is. I've never bought it because ever since I started garment sewing, I have had this pad of like artists tracing paper that I'm never gonna use for any other purpose. And so I have been using just like art tracing paper to trace my size. And then I cut the pattern pieces out of the tracing paper, not the printer paper. So that's a little tidbit for you. Again, take it or leave it. I'm not an expert, but that is what I have found works well. And it saves me from having to reassemble this stupid pattern in the future. Something you will see me do is cut apart the pattern pieces. So I'm not actually cutting out my size. I'm just separating like the front from the back. And that is purely for storage purposes. I find it is easier to just manage the storage of my patterns if I separate the pieces. So you will see me do that, but I'm not cutting out my size from the printer paper. We're purely separating things. right, so I have my tissue paper cut out. My pattern pieces are all cut out. The last thing that I always like to do in preparing my pattern is to see if I have to lengthen or shorten the pieces. In reality for me, I'm always lengthening them. I'm pretty tall, I'm 5'9", so a lot of patterns as they are written are drafted for someone who's a bit shorter. So sometimes I have to lengthen things. Sometimes I choose not to. Sometimes I like the more cropped fit. But yes, I have to decide if I need to lengthen my pattern pieces. A trick that I have heard and used that I find really helpful is to find an article of clothing in your closet, be it something that you've already made or something that you've purchased that you like the fit of and that you think will be similar fit to what you are making, and measure that piece of clothing. Measure the arms, measure the torso, and then make your pattern that length. So keeping in mind that you're gonna have some seam allowance, you're gonna hem it, but you can get a pretty good idea of how long to make your pattern pieces by just measuring and comparing to something that you already really like to wear. So I did some comparisons to some of my other t-shirts, and I don't think I actually need to lengthen anything. I think it's gonna be a good fit in that regard. So I have been working for about 2.5 hours just cutting out my pattern pieces. It's a lot of work. I heard someone say once that the bulk of sewing is not the actual sewing part, it's the preparation and, you know, the cutting and the pinning and the ironing. You actually spend very little time sewing when you are sewing. And I think that is definitely true. So now that that hell is over, I think I'm gonna be done for the day and cut into my fabric a different day. I'm just like really itching to sit on the couch for a while and knit on my sweater. So I'll see you all on a different day, but got some good work done today. And that is everything I worked on in the month of November. Looking ahead, I am hoping that next month I am able to finish up both of these projects and maybe get started on a few new things. As always, if you liked today's video, please give it a thumbs up, leave it a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. I will be back again in about 2 weeks with another video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all later. Bye, everyone.